Close your eyes for a moment and picture the bustling streets of ancient Thebes, the scent of spices and sweat mingling in the air, the sound of merchants calling out, children playing by the Nile, but above all, one aroma dominates everything. Warm, earthy, unmistakable, the smell of fresh bread baking. For the ancient Egyptians, bread wasn't just food, it was life itself, it was currency, it was religion, it was the very foundation of their civilization. And today, we are about to step back in time 4,000 years back to recreate that bread exactly as they did, using the same grains, the same methods, and even the same wild yeast that floated through the air of pharaohs and pyramid builders. What if I told you that by tasting this bread, we might taste history itself, that we could unlock secrets about daily life, culture, and even the beliefs of people who walked this earth millennia ago? This isn't just a cooking experiment, it's an archaeological journey, a sensory time machine. We're not simply mixing flour and water, we're reaching across centuries to understand what sustained one of history's greatest civilizations. How they worked, how they worshipped, how they lived and died, all of it is baked into the humble loaf we're about to bring back to life. So join me as we venture into this extraordinary recreation. Together, we'll grind Emmer wheat as they did, harness wild yeast from the air, and bake in a replica of an ancient oven. We'll discover why bread was so much more than sustenance. It was a symbol of life, a tool of the gods, and a thread connecting every layer of society, from enslaved workers to the divine pharaoh. This is more than a recipe revival, it's a window into humanity's past, and I can't wait to share this journey with you. To truly appreciate this ancient bread, we must first understand its monumental role in Egyptian life. This wasn't a mere side dish, it was the absolute cornerstone of their existence, woven into the very fabric of their economy, their spirituality, and their daily survival. For the average Egyptian, a meal was almost unthinkable without bread. It was their primary source of calories, their sustenance through long hours of labor-building monuments that would defy time itself. But its significance stretched far beyond the dinner plate. Bread functioned as one of the world's earliest forms of organized currency. Workers at Deir el-Medina, the village of the artisans who built the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, were paid their wages in bread, beer, and other goods. The standard daily ration for a laborer might include 10 loaves of bread and 2 jars of beer. This system wasn't primitive, it was a sophisticated economy running on baked goods. The quality and size of the loaf even denoted its value, creating an edible scale of worth that everyone understood. This deep connection is immortalized in their art and language. The hieroglyph for food was simply a picture of a loaf of bread. Think about that for a moment. Their entire concept of sustenance was symbolized by this one staple. Tomb paintings and reliefs are filled with vivid, detailed baking scenes, left as instructions and provisions for the deceased in the afterlife. In the tomb of Ramesses III, we see vast bakeries in operation, knaaders working the dough, benders shaping the loaves, and rows of conical bread molds heating in ovens. These images were not just decorative, they were a vital guide for eternity, ensuring the departed would never hunger. Its role extended into the divine realm. Bread was a fundamental offering presented to the gods in temples, a sacred exchange between humanity and the deities who controlled the Nile's flood and the sun's journey. Loaves were placed on altars to nourish statues of gods, believed to contain their spiritual essence. This act blurred the line between the physical and the spiritual, making bread a conduit for worship. It was also placed in tombs as funerary offerings, meant to sustain the soul, or ka, on its perilous journey to the afterlife. From the humblest peasant to the god-king pharaoh, bread was the universal constant, a thread of dough that connected every single layer of this incredible civilization. This profound cultural importance is precisely why the archaeological evidence we rely on is so incredibly rich and detailed. It's as if the ancient Egyptians left us a detailed recipe book, not written on papyrus, but baked into the very fabric of their tombs and cities. Our journey to recreate their bread begins not in a kitchen, but with the tangible, physical remains they left behind, some of which have survived for over 4,000 years. Perhaps the most startling and direct evidence comes from the loaves of bread themselves, discovered placed as offerings in tombs to nourish the deceased in the afterlife. These aren't just impressions or fragments, we have actual desiccated loaves, preserved by the dry Egyptian climate. In tombs at Thebes and other sites, archaeologists have uncovered loaves that are still intact, their shapes perfectly recognizable. These ancient offerings provide a priceless snapshot. We can see the exact shapes and sizes they preferred, from conical forms baked in molds to round, flat discs. Some even bear the baker's fingerprints, a hauntingly personal connection to an individual who lived and worked millennia ago. These aren't just artifacts, they are time capsules of a daily ritual, frozen in time for us to discover. Beyond the complete loaves, the very tools of the trade have been unearthed, giving us a clear blueprint for reconstruction. At the site of Amarna, the capital city built by the pharaoh Akhenaten, excavations have revealed entire neighborhoods with bakeries. Here we find stacks of the distinctive conical clay bread molds, known as beja, often found still sitting in rows exactly as they were left. These molds were crucial. Bakers would preheat them in a fire, then pour the dough into the scorching hot cones, which would create a burst of steam and cook the loaf from all sides, resulting in a characteristic shape we see in so many hieroglyphs. Analyzing the wear patterns, soot marks, and even residue on these molds tells us about baking temperatures, how often they were used, and the types of breads they produced. The science of archaeology adds another layer of understanding through residue analysis. Using sophisticated techniques like gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, scientists can analyze tiny fragments of bread found in pottery or on grinding stones. These microscopic clues are like culinary fingerprints. They have detected the presence of Emmer wheat, barley, and even unexpected ingredients like coriander seeds, dates, and tuber flour, revealing that their bread was often far from plain. This shows a sophisticated understanding of flavor and nutrition, and perhaps even the use of what was available to stretch precious grain supplies in harder times. This scientific dissection confirms what art and artifacts suggest, giving us a complete picture of the ingredients and methods that defined Egyptian bread making, allowing us to replicate them with astonishing accuracy. But to truly bake like an Egyptian, we must first gather our ingredients, and this is where our modern assumptions about bread begin to fall away. Our journey starts not with the refined, bleached all-purpose flour found in supermarkets today, but with a grain that modern palates have largely forgotten, Emmer wheat. Known to the Egyptians as Bat, Emmer was the undisputed king of ancient grains in the Nile Valley. This isn't the wheat we know, it's a hulled wheat, meaning each grain is tightly encased in a tough, inedible husk called a glume. This presented our ancient bakers with their first major challenge. Before anything else could happen, the grain had to be parched in a fire to dry it out, then meticulously pounded with heavy stone pestles in wide mortars to crack open those stubborn husks without crushing the precious seed inside. This was backbreaking, time-consuming labor, often performed by women, and it was an essential daily chore. Why go to all this trouble? Because Emmer was perfectly suited to the Egyptian environment. It was a hardy crop, resistant to the pests and diseases that could wipe out other grains, and it thrived in the fertile silt deposited by the annual Nile flood. This grain was so fundamental that it was a primary unit of trade and taxation, The wealth of the land was literally measured in sacks of emmer. Its nutritional profile was also superior to many modern wheats, higher in protein and minerals, making it the true staff of life that built the pyramids. The next ingredient seems simple, water, but in ancient Egypt, water was never just water, it was the sacred lifeblood of the Nile. Bakers didn't use just any water, they drew it directly from the great river itself. This wasn't a mere convenience, it was a crucial, if unknowing, culinary step. The Nile water was teeming with microscopic life, including wild yeasts and naturally occurring lactobacilli bacteria. Using this water to mix their dough meant they were instantly creating a natural levain, or sourdough starter. Before they even knew what that was, the river provided the leavening agent. This is a profound concept. Their bread was literally leavened by the very essence of their land, infused with the unique microbiome of the Nile Delta. This would have given their bread a distinct, tangy flavor profile, a taste of place that we would call terroir today. Furthermore, the Nile's water, rich with suspended silt and minerals, might have also subtly influenced the dough's chemistry, affecting its texture and fermentation. Every loaf was a product of its specific time and location, a unique collaboration between baker and river, and this brings us to the most magical ingredient of all, wild yeast. The ancient Egyptians didn't have little packets of commercial yeast. Instead, they harnessed an invisible, airborne resource. They understood, through generations of trial and observation, that if they left a mixture of flour and Nile water out in the open, it would eventually begin to bubble and ferment. They were capturing wild Saccharomyces cerevisiae yeasts floating in the air, the same microorganisms that give sourdough its lift and complex flavor. They likely maintained these culture for years, perhaps even generations, passing a piece of fermented dough from one baking day to the next. This practice, known as backslopping, would have created stable, well-adapted starter cultures with a unique local character. The yeasts from a bakery in Memphis would have been slightly different from those in Thebes, creating regional variations in bread. This natural leavening process resulted in a bread that was more nutritious as well. The long, slow fermentation broke down phytic acid present in the whole emmer grain, making its minerals more bioavailable and easier to digest. Their daily bread was, therefore, a powerful probiotic, contributing to gut health in a way they couldn't have understood scientifically but undoubtedly experienced physically. It was sustenance, science, and a little bit of magic, all baked into one humble loaf. To truly grasp the significance of this ancient grain, we have to look at its journey from the field to the grinder. Emmer wheat's entire life cycle was dictated by the greatest natural force in Egypt, the Nile's annual inundation. The farming year began not with a planting, but with a waiting period as the river overflowed its banks, depositing a fresh layer of incredibly rich, mineral-laden silt across the floodplain. This was nature's fertilizer, a yearly gift that made the desert bloom without any effort from the farmers. Once the waters receded, leaving the soil moist and perfect for sowing, farmers would release their livestock into the fields. The animals' hooves would trample the seeds into the fertile mud, a simple yet effective method that eliminated the need for complex plowing in many cases. This entire agricultural symphony was orchestrated around the river, creating a sustainable cycle that endured for millennia. The success of the entire civilization, and by extension the bread on every table, hinged on this predictable, life-giving flood. Harvesting this precious crop was a communal effort that defined a season. Using sickles made from sharpened flakes of chert, a hard, glassy stone set into wooden handles, teams of workers would move through the golden fields. They wouldn't cut the stalks low down as we do today. Instead, they cut them high up, just below the seed heads. This left the nutrient-rich straw standing in the field, which would later be gathered for animal fodder, mud brick making, and other crucial purposes. Nothing was wasted. The gathered emmer spikes, now bundled and transported to the threshing floor, faced their next hurdle. Remember, emmer is a hulled wheat. To access the edible grain inside the tough glooms, the harvested spikes were spread out on a hard, packed circular floor and threshed by having donkeys or oxen walk in circles over them, dragging a heavy sledge behind them. This brutal process broke the spikes apart and cracked the hulls. Then came winnowing, where workers used wooden forks to toss the crushed mixture into the air. The wind would carry away the lighter chaff, the brittle husks and straw, while the heavier grains and smaller debris fell back to the ground. This was repeated until mostly clean grain remained, a process captured in tomb paintings that show the backbreaking work under the hot Egyptian sun. Storage was a matter of national security. This harvested emmer was wealth, and protecting it from rot, insects, and thieves was paramount. The grain was stored in massive, centralized granaries, often dome-shaped mud brick structures that were cool and dry, or in large sealed pottery jars within individual homes. The state carefully monitored these supplies, as a bad harvest or poor storage could lead to famine and social unrest. The biblical story of Joseph advising the Pharaoh to store grain during 7 years of plenty is a perfect illustration of how deeply this concern was etched into the Near Eastern consciousness. The abundance of grain, and by extension bread, was directly equated with the power and divine favor of the Pharaoh. A full granary meant a stable, prosperous kingdom. An empty one could spell its downfall. But why go through all this immense effort for emmer? The answer lies in its incredible nutritional power. Compared to modern refined wheat, emmer is a nutritional powerhouse. It is significantly higher in protein, providing essential building blocks for a population engaged in monumental construction projects. It's also rich in fiber, vitamins like B1 and B3, and crucial minerals such as magnesium, iron, and zinc. This dense nutritional profile made emmer bread a truly sustaining food. A worker could perform hours of grueling labor on a diet primarily composed of this bread and beer, another product made from emmer. Furthermore, the slow fermentation process of their natural sourdough starter would pre-digest some of the grains, breaking down anti-nutrients like phytic acid and making all those vitamins and minerals even easier for their bodies to absorb. Their bread wasn't just filling their stomachs, it was efficiently fueling a civilization, giving them the lasting energy to achieve the impossible. This humble grain, painstakingly cultivated and processed, was quite literally the building block of ancient Egypt, consumed by the thousands of laborers who raised the pyramids and enjoyed at the tables of the gods themselves. With the precious emmer grain finally separated from its hull and safely stored, the next step in its transformation into bread was perhaps the most grueling and time-consuming of all, turning those hard, dry kernels into usable flour. This was a world away from simply scooping pre-ground flour from a sack. The ancient Egyptian method relied on two simple yet brutally effective tools, the saddle quern and the hand-held grinding stone. The saddle quern was a base, typically made from a heavy, oblong piece of sandstone or granite with a concave surface that cradled the grain. The grinder, a smaller, heavier stone called a mano, was then pushed and pulled across the grain with a rocking motion, using the baker's full body weight to crush the kernels between the two abrasive surfaces. This was not a quick task. It has been estimated that grinding enough flour to bake bread for a single family could take several hours of relentless, back-breaking labor each day. This arduous daily chore fell almost exclusively to women, and the physical toll is evident in the remains of ancient skeletons, which often show signs of arthritis in the knees, hips, and lower back, as well as severe wear on the toe joints from long hours spent kneeling in a crouched position, using their legs for leverage as they rocked back and forth. The constant inhalation of fine, abrasive stone dust also likely led to respiratory issues. making this a sacrifice baked into every single loaf. The texture of the resulting flour was everything, and it was decidedly not the fine, snow-white powder we know today. This was a whole grain flour in the truest sense. The grinding process produced a coarse, gritty meal filled with tiny fragments of the grain's bran and germ. There was no sifting or bolting to remove these elements. Everything went into the mix. This texture fundamentally defined the character of Egyptian bread. That gritty, fibrous content meant the bread was dense, hearty, and chewy. It also had a dark, speckled appearance, far removed from our modern idea of white bread. Every bite would have been a reminder of the immense effort required to produce it, a tangible connection to the labor of the fields and the grindstone. This coarse grind also had a practical effect on the baking process. The larger particles absorbed liquid differently than fine flour, and the bran specks could even puncture the delicate gas bubbles produced by the wild yeast during fermentation. This is part of the reason why Egyptian breads were often denser and had a more close-knit crumb structure compared to the airy, open texture of some modern sourdoughs. They were creating sustenance, not delicacy. This intimate, physical connection to their food source through the grinding process reveals a profound truth about their relationship with bread. For us, flour is an ingredient. For them, it was the product of intense personal exertion, the heat of the stone, the strain in the muscles, the sound of grinding. These sensory experiences were woven into the very essence of the bread long before it ever reached the oven. The final loaf was not merely consumed, it was earned. This deep, physical understanding of their primary food source, from the sowing of the seed to the crushing of the grain, grounded their entire civilization in a tangible reality that we have largely lost. The value of their bread was measured not just in its nutritional content, but in the sheer human energy invested in its creation, making it truly the most valuable currency they had. Now, with our coarse, freshly ground Emmer flour ready, we arrive at the true heart of the ancient baker's magic, the invisible, living ingredient that transformed a dense, flat paste into a risen, living loaf. The ancient Egyptians were pioneers of leavening, and their method was a stroke of genius born from keen observation and a deep, intuitive understanding of their environment. Without any knowledge of microbiology, they became masters of harnessing wild, airborne yeasts, making them arguably the world's first great sourdough bakers. This wasn't a controlled science, it was a beautiful, symbiotic relationship with the very air they breathed. Their primary method was almost certainly what we now call a spontaneous starter. A baker would simply mix their flour with water, that all-important Nile water, teeming with its own microbial life, and leave the paste exposed to the open air. Floating all around them were wild spores of Saccharomyces cerevisiae and various strains of beneficial lactobacilli bacteria. These microorganisms would settle into the moist, starchy mixture and, given the warm Egyptian climate, would rapidly begin to ferment. Within a day or two, that seemingly inert paste would come alive, bubbling, rising, and developing a distinct, tangy aroma. This captured culture was their yeast, a unique local blend of microbes that varied from one bakery to the next, even from one day to the next, giving every neighborhood's bread its own distinctive character. But they didn't start from scratch every single time. Once a culture was established, they practiced what is known as backslopping. This is the crucial, time-saving technique that turned a happy accident into a reliable process. At the end of a baking day, a wise baker would tear off a piece of the raw, fermented dough from that day's batch. This piece, teeming with a vigorous, active colony of yeast and bacteria, would be mixed into the next day's fresh flour and water. This small act ensured a stable, predictable culture that grew stronger and more adapted to the bakery's specific conditions with each passing day. A successful starter might be maintained for years, even generations, becoming a baker's most prized possession, a living library of flavor and leavening power. This practice is immortalized in a scene from the 5th dynasty tomb of Tai at Saqqara, which shows a baker apparently kneading dough in a large jar. Many Egyptologists believe this jar likely held just such a maintained sourdough starter, a precious resource kept safe and separate. The result of this natural fermentation was a bread that was not only lighter and more palatable, but also significantly more nutritious. The long, slow process, driven by wild yeasts that work less aggressively than modern commercial ones, allowed enzymes to pre-digest the complex starches and proteins in the tough Emmer grain. This breakdown neutralized phytic acid, an anti-nutrient that can block the absorption of minerals like iron and zinc, making the bread's inherent nutritional profile more bioavailable to those who ate it. Furthermore, the lactic acid bacteria produced during fermentation acted as a natural preservative, helping the bread resist mold and stay edible longer in the heat, a critical advantage in a world without refrigeration. Their daily bread was, in effect, a powerful probiotic, contributing to gut health and overall well-being in a way they understood through experience rather than science. This revolutionary technique, born from patience and a profound connection to their environment, gave them a culinary and nutritional advantage that sustained their civilization for millennia. Now, with our living, bubbling sourdough starter ready and our coarse Emmer flour prepared, it was time for the most dramatic transformation of all, the application of fire. The ancient Egyptian baker had a fascinating array of ovens at their disposal, each designed for a specific purpose and capable of creating a stunning variety of breads. The most iconic and revolutionary of these was the conical clay oven, known to Egyptologists as a beja mold. These weren't ovens in the way we think of them today, with a door and a single chamber. Instead, they were individual preheated tools that acted like portable, intense heat sources. A baker would build a large, hot fire, often fueled by the abundant dried dung from their livestock, which provided a steady, intense heat. They would then place a stack of these conical clay pots directly into the heart of the flames, letting them heat until they were scorching hot and glowing. Once the fire had died down to embers, the baker, using long, forked sticks or damp rags to protect their hands, would quickly invert a preheated cone, pour a portion of the liquidy fermented dough directly into the hot cavity, and then place the cone back amidst the coals. The effect was instantaneous and spectacular. The intense heat of the clay would flash cook the outside of the dough, creating a firm crust almost immediately, while the steam trapped inside would cause the loaf to surge upwards, creating a distinctive domed or mushroom-shaped bread with a surprisingly airy interior. This method was incredibly efficient, allowing a single baker to manage dozens of these molds at once, producing a high volume of loaves in a relatively short time. The evidence for this is everywhere in the archaeological record, from rows of fire, blackened cones found in bakery areas to the very shape of the loaves themselves, perfectly preserved in tomb offerings. But the conical oven was just one tool in a diverse baking arsenal. For larger, flatter breads or for a quicker method, bakers often turned to baking directly on the hot embers or on a preheated flat stone slab placed over the fire, a technique known as baking on a sage. This would produce a type of flatbread similar to a pita or a naan that could be ready in minutes. Another common method involved using a large, wide-mouthed ceramic jar known as a tanner. The baker would build a fire inside the jar, letting the clay walls absorb the heat. Once the fire had burned down, they would slap the rounds of dough directly onto the hot interior walls, where they would bake quickly, puffing up from the radiant heat. This technique is still used throughout the Middle East today, a direct culinary link stretching back thousands of years. The choice of method wasn't arbitrary. It was a decision based on the type of bread being made, the ingredients available, and the required output. A large estate bakery supplying workers might rely heavily on the efficient begecones, while a smaller household might use the simpler tanner jar or flat stones for their daily baking. Managing this heat was a true art form, a skill passed down through generations. Without thermometers, bakers learned to read the fire's color and the intensity of the heat radiating from the clay. They knew precisely how long to let the beja molds heat in the fire and exactly when to pull them out for the perfect bake. The type of fuel mattered greatly too. While wood was used when available, the treeless landscape of Egypt made it a precious commodity. The most common fuel was actually dried cakes of animal dung mixed with straw. This might sound unappealing to our modern sensibilities, but it was a brilliant and sustainable solution. Dung burns with a very hot, consistent, and relatively long-lasting flame, providing the perfect steady heat needed for the conical ovens. There's no evidence that this imparted any unpleasant flavors to the bread. The intense, direct heat of the clay would have vaporized any potential impurities long before the dough was poured in. This practical adaptation shows the incredible resourcefulness of Egyptian bakers, turning the waste products from their animals into the fuel that baked the bread that fed their civilization. It was a perfect closed-loop system where nothing was wasted and every element of their world was utilized in the daily miracle of creating bread. The variety of shapes we see in ancient Egyptian bread is astonishing, and each form tells its own story of practicality, symbolism, and regional tradition. Far from being a uniform staple, bread came in a dazzling array of geometries, from simple discs to intricate spirals, and the choice of shape was rarely arbitrary. One of the most common and practical forms was the simple, round, flat loaf. This was likely the everyday bread of the common people, baked quickly on a hot stone or the walls of a jar oven. Its simplicity meant it required no special tools, just a pair of hands to pat the dough into a round. These rounds could be torn and shared, used to scoop up stews and dips, or even as edible plates, sopping up the juices of a meal. Their flat nature ensured they cooked through quickly and evenly, making them an efficient choice for a family's daily needs. Tomb paintings often show stacks of these round loaves, sometimes with a distinctive cross score on top, perhaps to help them bake more evenly or to denote a specific type or bakery. Then we have the truly iconic shape, the conical or domed loaf, the signature bread baked in those preheated clay beja molds. This wasn't just a stylistic choice, it was a marvel of culinary engineering. The conical mold acted like a miniature oven, creating an intense, all-around heat shock that caused the wet, fermented dough to erupt upwards, creating a light, airy interior encased in a firm, crusty shell. The resulting loaf was self-contained, easy to handle, and perfectly portioned, but the shape may have carried a deeper meaning as well. Some Egyptologists have proposed that the conical form was deliberately symbolic, meant to resemble the primeval mound of creation. In Egyptian mythology, the first land emerged from the watery chaos of Nun as a pyramidal hill. By shaping bread the substance of life in this form, they might have been symbolically recreating and consuming the very act of creation itself, turning every meal into a small religious observance. This beautifully blurs the line between the mundane and the divine, a physical object that was both practical food and a powerful religious symbol. Beyond these two common types, the artistic record reveals a bakery's worth of imaginative forms. There were long, slender loaves that resemble modern baguettes, twisted and knotted rolls that look like pretzels, and even plated loaves similar to a challah. Some tomb models from the Middle Kingdom, designed to magically provide food for the deceased, show bread shaped like fish, animals, or even human figures. These elaborate forms were almost certainly special occasion breads, perhaps for festivals, offerings to a specific god, or funerary rites. The time and skill required to shape them elevated them from mere sustenance to something ceremonial and sacred. The reason for such variety is multifaceted. Practically, different shapes had different baking properties. A thin, flat loaf would be crisp, while a thick, conical one would be soft inside. Culturally, the shape could denote the bread's purpose: a standard ration for workers, a high-quality loaf for a temple offering, or a festive bread for a celebration. The shape was a language in itself, communicating the bread's status, destination, and meaning before a single crumb was even tasted. The physical evidence for this comes directly from the clay molds themselves, found by the dozens at archaeological sites like the workers' village at Deir el-Medina and the city of Amarna. These molds are not all identical. They vary in size, depth, and even the coarseness of the clay from which they were made. Some are small and delicate, perhaps for finer breads, while others are large and robust, made for producing substantial loaves to feed laborers. Excavations often find them stacked together, sometimes still bearing the sooty black residue of countless firings. This standardization is telling. It suggests a scale of production and a system of measurement. A worker's daily ration might be, for example, 2 loaves from a medium-sized mold. The baker knew exactly how much dough to pour into each type of mold to produce a consistent product, and the people receiving the bread understood its value based on its size and shape. These humble clay cones, often overlooked in museum displays, are the keys to understanding the entire economics and logistics of ancient Egyptian bread production. They turned the abstract idea of nourishment into a tangible, measurable, and distributable unit of life. Armed with this deep understanding of the history, the ingredients, and the methods, our journey now shifts from the theoretical to the tangible. The time has finally come to roll up our sleeves and begin the physical recreation, to connect with this ancient process not just through research, but through the feel of the grain and the smell of the fermenting dough. Our first challenge was sourcing the most crucial ingredient, authentic Emmer wheat. This was no small feat, as Emmer, also known as farro medio, is a largely forgotten crop in modern industrial agriculture. After an extensive search, we managed to locate a small-scale organic farm dedicated to reviving ancient grains. The Emmer they provided was a world apart from modern wheat. The seeds were smaller, darker, and still encased in their tough, protective husks, arriving exactly as they would have thousands of years ago, a direct link to the past in a simple burlap sack. The next step was to replicate the most grueling part of the process, the milling. We could have taken a shortcut and used a modern electric mill, but that would have completely defeated the purpose. To truly understand the effort involved, we needed to feel the physical toll. We used an accurate replica of a granite saddle quern and hand grinder based on artifacts found at sites like Giza and Amarna. The process was immediately humbling. Pouring a small amount of the parched, hulled Emmer onto the coarse stone surface, I began the rocking, grinding motion. The sound was a harsh, grating crunch, and within just a few minutes, the strain in my shoulders and back was undeniable. This wasn't a gentle process, it was a full-body workout. The resulting flour was everything the research suggested: coarse, gritty, and speckled with dark bran. It had a warm, nutty, and profoundly earthy aroma that filled the air, a scent that commercial flour simply doesn't possess. Holding this flour in my hands, I gained a completely new, visceral appreciation for the daily labor of ancient Egyptian women. This wasn't just an ingredient, it was a product of immense physical exertion. Now for the most mystical element, the water. To achieve true authenticity, we needed water from the Nile. While we couldn't travel to Egypt for this experiment, we employed a fascinating and scientifically valid alternative. We used a local water source but introduced a specific microbial culture. a dried sample of sediment taken from the banks of the Nile and rehydrated. This unique approach, suggested by an archaeobotanist colleague, was our best chance of capturing the authentic wild yeasts and bacteria that would have naturally leavened ancient dough. Mixing this special water with our freshly ground Emmer flour was a moment of pure anticipation. There's no exact recipe from antiquity, so we relied on descriptions of dough consistency from tomb scenes, aiming for a thick, sticky, but pourable batter, much like a modern sourdough starter or a thick pancake mix. The final act of creation was to combine everything. We added a portion of active starter we had begun cultivating weeks earlier using the Nile sediment, a practice mirroring the ancient backslopping technique. As I mixed the coarse flour, the water, and the starter together with a wooden spoon, the texture was immediately different from any modern dough I've handled. The gritty bran particles were clearly visible, and the mixture was exceptionally thick and sticky, clinging to the bowl in a way that promised a very dense, hearty loaf. We covered the bowl with a linen cloth, just as they might have, and set it in a warm spot to ferment. Now, all we could do was wait and hope that the wild yeasts, descendants of those that floated over the pharaoh's Egypt, would awaken once more and perform their ancient, miraculous work. After the initial mix, the dough entered a phase that required both muscle and intuition, kneading. Without the smooth, elastic texture of modern wheat gluten, Emmer dough behaved entirely differently. It wouldn't achieve the smooth, windowpane stretch of a high gluten loaf. Instead, it was a sticky, shaggy, and stubborn mass. Tomb paintings offer us our best clues for their techniques. They often show benders, not just kneaders, vigorously working the dough in large, wide pottery jars. They would have used their entire upper body strength, likely folding the dough over onto itself repeatedly, slapping it down into the container, and using a punching motion to drive out large air pockets and encourage even fermentation. This wasn't a gentle process. It was an aggressive, physical act meant to thoroughly incorporate the wild yeast throughout the dense, gritty flour and to align the proteins enough to create some structure, however limited. The goal wasn't perfection, but cohesion, transforming a loose, lumpy batter into a workable mass that could hold onto the precious gases the yeast would produce. The magic, however, happened not during the kneading, but in the quiet waiting period that followed. Fermentation was the true heart of the process, and ancient bakers were masters of controlling time and temperature without a single clock or thermometer. They understood through generations of observation that the warm, consistent climate of Egypt was their greatest ally. A batch of dough left in a shaded corner of the mud brick bakery in the morning would be perfectly risen and pungent by the afternoon. They learned to read the dough itself for signs of readiness, a surface domed and dotted with bubbles, a distinct sour, earthy aroma, and a slight jiggle to the entire mass. This slow, natural fermentation was the key to unlocking the bread's full flavor and nutrition. The wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria worked in a long, slow dance, producing not only carbon dioxide for lift, but also a complex cocktail of organic acids that gave the bread its characteristic tang and made it more digestible. Controlling this process was an art of adaptation. In the cooler winter months, a baker might place the dough jar closer to the fading heat of the oven or even partially bury it in the still warm embers to maintain a consistent temperature. In the intense heat of summer, they might seek out the coolest, most shaded part of the bakery to prevent the fermentation from racing ahead too quickly and collapsing. They were constantly interacting with their environment, using it as a tool. The most skilled bakers could likely judge a batch's progress by a mere glance or sniff, knowing exactly when it had reached its peak and was ready for the oven's intense heat. This intimate sensory connection to the living dough is something largely lost in modern, scheduled baking, but it was the defining skill of the ancient Egyptian baker, turning simple flour and water into a living, breathing substance ready to be transformed by fire. For our baking stage, we constructed a replica oven based on excavations from Amarna, using the same materials and design principles an ancient craftsman would have recognized. The core structure was built from a mixture of Nile silt clay and chopped straw, a combination that provides excellent insulation and thermal mass, helping to retain the fierce heat needed for baking. The design we chose was a simple, beehive-shaped dome with a single opening at the front for feeding the fire and inserting the bread, a style depicted in numerous tomb scenes and found in the ruins of large-scale bakeries. The process of building it was a lesson in ancient thermodynamics. The thick clay walls, about a hand's width thick, were designed to absorb and radiate heat evenly, creating a stable baking environment far more sophisticated than a simple open fire. The firing process began long before the dough was ready. We started with a small kindling fire inside the cold oven, gradually adding larger pieces of acacia wood and dried dung cakes, the most common fuels available to an Egyptian baker. This slow, careful buildup is crucial. A fire that's too large, too fast, can cause thermal shock, creating cracks in the clay walls. Over the course of an hour, we steadily fed the fire, letting the flames lick against the dome's interior, slowly transferring their energy into the dense clay. The goal was to heat the entire mass of the oven, not just the air inside it. We monitored progress not with a thermometer, but by observing the color of the interior walls. Initially black with soot, they gradually turned a dull red, then a brighter, glowing orange. At its peak, the temperature inside soared to well over 400 degrees Celsius, a heat that felt like standing at the mouth of a volcano. This preheating phase was a test of patience, a slow ritual of building and tending the fire that stood in stark contrast to the instant, push-button heat of a modern oven. Once the oven reached its peak temperature and the wood had burned down to a deep bed of glowing embers, it was time for the critical next step, clearing the hearth. Using a long green palm frond as a makeshift rake, a tool that wouldn't catch fire, we carefully swept all the embers and ash to the very back and sides of the oven, creating a clean, scorching hot floor in the front. This exposed surface, now radiating an intense, dry heat, was our baking surface. In a modern kitchen, we simply set a temperature. Here, we were managing a living, breathing entity of heat and flame. The difference is one of direct engagement versus remote control. A modern oven provides consistent, predictable, indirect heat. This replica oven provided radiant, intense, direct heat that required constant attention and adjustment, forcing the baker to work in harmony with the fire's behavior. The moment of truth had arrived. I took a portion of our bubbly, fermented Emmer dough, shaped it into a round, flat disc, and using a long, flat wooden paddle, another tool seen in tomb paintings, I quickly slapped it directly onto the searing hot clay floor. The reaction was immediate and visceral. A loud, satisfying hiss filled the air as the dough made contact, and the surface of the loaf began to cook instantaneously. Within seconds, the characteristic bubbles of sourdough began to puff up, and the most incredible aroma of roasting grain and earth filled the space around us. This direct contact method, baking on the hot floor, is a technique still used today in traditions like the Italian pizza or the Indian tandoori naan, a direct culinary thread connecting us to the ancient world. For larger batches, a baker might have used the conical molds, preheating them in the fire and then inverting them over the dough, but for our test, the direct method felt most primal and connected. The bake itself was astonishingly fast. Where a modern loaf might take 40 minutes, this ancient bread was ready in a fraction of the time. In less than 5 minutes, the bottom had formed a firm, dark crust and the top had set. Using the paddle, I deftly flipped the loaf to ensure even cooking, a maneuver that required speed and precision to avoid the intense heat. In under 10 minutes, the bread was done, steaming, fragrant, and beautifully charred in spots. The speed was a key advantage of this technology. A skilled baker with a fully heated oven could produce dozens of loaves in an hour, rapidly baking one batch after another by continuously managing the fire and the placement of the dough. This efficiency was essential for feeding a workforce of thousands. Pulling that first finished loaf from the oven, with its crackling crust and smoky scent, was a moment of pure, transcendent connection. We weren't just baking bread, we were participating in a 4,000-year-old ritual of transformation, where grain, water, and fire united through human skill to create life itself. The moment of truth is here. After hours of grinding, days of nurturing the wild yeast starter, and the intense, smoky ritual of baking in the replica oven, we finally hold a piece of history in our hands. The loaf is still warm, radiating a heat that feels ancient. Its aroma is the first thing that strikes you. It's profoundly different from the smell of a modern bakery. There's no simple, comforting scent of white flour here. Instead, it's a deep, complex, and almost primal fragrance. It smells intensely earthy and nutty, like toasted grains and warm stones, with a distinct, sharp tang from the wild fermentation that fills the air around it. It's a scent that speaks of the fields, the river, and the fire, all captured in one crusty, irregular loaf. Now for the texture. The exterior is incredibly rugged, with a crust that's dark in some spots and blistered from the direct contact with the scorching oven floor. It feels substantial, weighty, as I break it open, and you have to tear it. It's far too rugged to slice neatly. The sound is a satisfying, coarse crackle. The interior crumb is nothing like the soft, pillowy, uniform holes of a modern artisan sourdough. This is dense, tight, and packed with visible specks of the coarse bran from the whole Emmer grain. It's moist and chewy, with a definite grittiness that you can feel immediately between your fingers. This is a bread that requires effort to eat. Every chew is a reminder of the stone quern and the physical labor invested in its creation. And then the taste. The first flavor that hits is that pronounced sour tang, a robust, almost assertive acidity from the long, wild fermentation that is much stronger than in most modern sourdoughs. This is followed immediately by the deep, nutty, and wonderfully complex flavor of the Emmer wheat itself, notes of toasted hazelnut, rye, and a hint of sweetness that unfolds as you chew. The gritty texture isn't just a physical feel, it releases these layered flavors gradually. The charred bits from the oven floor add a subtle, smoky bitterness that perfectly balances the tang and the nuttiness. There is no single, simple flavor note. It's a symphony of earthy, sour, and savory that is incredibly satisfying and feels fundamentally nourishing. Comparing this to the bread we know today is like comparing a whole, unpolished gemstone to a faceted diamond. Modern commercial bread, even many good artisan loaves, often prioritizes a uniform, soft texture and a mild, gentle flavor profile. Our ancient loaf is the polar opposite. It is all about robust, unapologetic character. The experience is less about comfort and more about substance. You wouldn't use this bread for a delicate tea sandwich. You would use it to sop up a hearty stew, to fuel a long day of physical labor, to truly fill your stomach and feed your body. The differences are a direct result of its creation: the coarse, whole grain flour, the powerful wild yeast, and the fierce, direct heat of the oven. It is a food of function and survival, but crafted with a skill that elevates it to an art form. This first bite is more than just a taste test, it's a sensory portal. That gritty texture on the tongue is the same sensation a worker at Deir el Medina would have felt after a long day carving a royal tomb. The tang of the wild yeast is the taste of the Nile's ecosystem, a flavor literally captured from the ancient air. The smoky crust carries the essence of the oven fired by dung and straw, the very fuels that bake the bread that built the pyramids. In this single mouthful, we are connected across millennia to the daily life of an entire civilization. It's a humble, hearty, and powerful food that tells the story of human ingenuity, resilience, and our timeless relationship with the grains that have sustained us since the dawn of agriculture. Tasting it doesn't just answer our question of what ancient Egyptian bread was like, it makes the past feel vividly, deliciously real. This incredible bread wasn't just about flavor, it was a nutritional powerhouse perfectly designed by circumstance to sustain one of history's most industrious civilizations. When we analyze its components from a modern scientific perspective, its effectiveness becomes breathtakingly clear. The foundation was Emmer wheat, a grain far superior in many ways to its modern descendants. Emmer is notably higher in protein, providing essential amino acids crucial for building and repairing muscle tissue, a vital resource for a workforce engaged in constant, monumental construction. It's also packed with dietary fiber, which promotes a healthy digestive system and provides a slow, steady release of energy, preventing the sharp spikes and crashes associated with refined carbohydrates. This complex carbohydrate was the perfect fuel for long, grueling days under the Egyptian sun. Beyond the macronutrients, Emmer is a rich source of essential micronutrients. It contains significantly higher levels of minerals like magnesium, which supports nerve and muscle function, zinc, vital for immune health and wound healing, and iron, which is critical for preventing anemia and maintaining energy levels. It's also a good source of B vitamins, particularly B1 thiamine and B3 niacin, which are essential for converting food into usable energy. This dense nutritional profile meant that a diet centered on this bread, especially when supplemented with beer, onions, and occasional fish or legumes, was far from deficient. It was a highly efficient system for delivering a broad spectrum of nutrients to a massive population. The ancient baking process itself acted as a form of prehistoric food science, dramatically enhancing the bread's nutritional bioavailability. The long, slow fermentation driven by their wild yeast and lactic acid bacteria was the key to this unlocking. These microorganisms produce enzymes that act as predigesters, breaking down phytic acid, a compound present in the bran of all whole grains. Phytic acid is often called an anti-nutrient because it binds to minerals like iron and zinc in the digestive tract, preventing your body from absorbing them. By neutralizing this compound, the fermentation process effectively supercharged the bread, making all those precious minerals and vitamins more accessible to the human body. This natural process meant that the ancient Egyptians were extracting more nutritional value from their grain than we would if we simply baked the same flour today without fermentation. Furthermore, this natural leavening created a bread that was a potent probiotic. The lactobacilli bacteria thriving in the sourdough starter are the same beneficial bacteria found in modern yogurts and supplements. Regular consumption of this live culture bread would have contributed to a healthy gut microbiome, improving digestion, bolstering the immune system, and reducing inflammation. When we consider the challenging living conditions and potential for waterborne illnesses, having a daily dietary staple that supported gut health would have been a significant advantage for overall population well-being. Their bread was literally medicine, a fact they understood through experience rather than science. Scientific studies on ancient grains and traditional fermentation methods strongly support this analysis. Research has shown that sourdough fermentation can reduce phytic acid content by up to 90% compared to unfermented whole grain bread. Other studies highlight that the type of fiber in ancient wheats like Emmer acts as a prebiotic, feeding the good bacteria in the gut and creating a virtuous cycle of health. The gritty, coarse texture of the bread, a result of the stone grinding, also played a positive role. That abrasive quality increased the surface area of the food, further aiding digestion and nutrient absorption while also promoting dental health by helping to clean teeth, a small but important side effect evident in the dental wear patterns on ancient Egyptian skeletons. When we step back and view this not as a single loaf, but as the caloric cornerstone of an entire society, its historical importance snaps into sharp focus. This nutritionally complete, easily distributable, and efficiently produced food source was the absolute bedrock of Egyptian power and stability. It provided the sustained energy required for the decades of labor that built the pyramids and temples of Luxor. It was a reliable, storable form of wealth that could be managed and rationed by the state to support a specialized class of artisans, priests, and soldiers who didn't farm their own food. The physical strength and overall health derived from this diet directly enabled the architectural and artistic achievements that still astonish us today. The mighty civilization of the pharaohs was quite literally built on the robust, gritty, and tangy foundation of Emmer sourdough bread. Beyond mere sustenance, bread held a sacred, transcendental role that connected the world of the living directly to the divine. In the temples that dotted the Nile, bread was the fundamental currency of worship, a daily offering presented to the gods to maintain the cosmic order, or mat. Each morning, priests would perform elaborate purification rituals before entering the inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, where the statue of a god like Amun-Ra or Hathor resided. Their most crucial task was to awaken the deity and present a lavish meal, and at the heart of this divine breakfast was bread, loaves of the highest quality, often baked in special shapes or from the finest, most finely sifted flour, were arranged on offering tables alongside cuts of meat, bowls of beer, and baskets of fruit. This act was not symbolic in the way we might think of it today. The Egyptians believed the statue was a vessel for the god's actual spirit, or Ka. The deity did not just appreciate the offering, they consumed its spiritual essence. The bread, through this ritual, literally nourished the god, giving them the strength to perform their duties, like ensuring the sun would rise again or the Nile would flood its banks. After the god had partaken of this spiritual nourishment, the now sanctified physical food was distributed to the temple staff and eventually to the people, creating a powerful continuum where a loaf of bread could travel from a baker's hands to a god's altar and back to a worshiper, now blessed and filled with divine power. This belief in bread's spiritual potency reached its most profound expression in the preparation for the afterlife. The journey to the eternal fields was perilous, and the soul would need sustenance for the long road ahead. This is why tombs were, in essence, well-stocked pantries for eternity. Actual, physical loaves of bread have been found placed in tombs, left by grieving families to ensure their loved one would not go hungry. In the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, over a dozen well-preserved loaves were discovered, each a different shape and size, representing a variety of breads for the king to enjoy. But the Egyptians, being pragmatic, also understood that physical bread could rot or be stolen, so they created magical backups. Elaborate tomb paintings and reliefs depict enormous quantities of food being produced, from harvesting grain to baking bread, intended to magically manifest in the afterlife for all eternity. They even created incredibly detailed, non-perishable model loaves out of painted wood or pottery, perfect stand-ins that would never decay. The most explicit instructions for this eternal provisioning come from funerary texts like the Book of the Dead. These spells, written on papyrus and placed in the coffin, were a guidebook for the soul. Specific chapters are essentially magical guarantees of endless food. Spell 52, for example, is a promise that the deceased will never have to suffer the indignity of eating their own waste in the afterlife, a fear that highlights how central real food was to their concept of paradise. More positively, Spell 149 provides a map of the 15 mysterious mounds of the underworld, each ruled by a god and offering a different, delectable type of bread to the worthy soul who knows their names and forms. To know the name of the bread of a specific mound was to have power over it, to be able to call it into existence. This transforms bread from a simple offering into a key element of cosmic knowledge, a signifier of the deceased's wisdom and their rightful place among the divine. In the Hall of Judgment, a person's heart was weighed against the feather of Maat. If they passed, they were granted access to the Field of Reeds, the Egyptian paradise, which was depicted not as a misty realm of spirits, but as a perfect, idealized version of Egypt itself, a place of abundant harvests where the wheat grew 7 cubits high, and the blessed dead would spend eternity harvesting grain and baking bread, never wanting for anything. Bread was so deeply woven into their concept of a good life that even in heaven, the ultimate reward was the ability to enjoy it forever, while our foundational Emmer and wild yeast loaf provides a stunning glimpse into the past. Residue analysis reveals the ancient Egyptian diet was far from monotonous. Their bread was a vibrant canvas for a surprising array of flavors, textures, and functional additives, turning a simple staple into a complex and regionally diverse food. Scientific analysis of desiccated loaves and pottery residues has detected traces of everything from sweet fruits to aromatic spices, suggesting bakers were constantly experimenting with what their environment provided to enhance both nutrition and taste. One of the most common and delightful discoveries is the use of dates. These sweet, sticky fruits would have been pounded into a paste and kneaded directly into the dough. This addition served multiple brilliant purposes. Primarily, it introduced a rich, caramel-like sweetness that balanced the pronounced sour tang of the wild yeast fermentation. But beyond flavor, dates are packed with natural sugars, which would have acted as additional food for the yeast, potentially creating a lighter, more active rise. They also contributed to a moister, denser crumb and helped preserve the bread longer by reducing water activity within the loaf. Finding a chunk of date within your ration bread would have been a small moment of joy, a burst of concentrated energy and flavor in an otherwise hearty and functional food. Honey, though a more expensive commodity, was also a prized additive, particularly for breads destined for temple offerings or the tables of the elite. Tomb paintings from the New Kingdom show beekeeping operations, highlighting the value of this natural sweetener. Adding honey to the dough would have created a richer, more luxurious loaf with a beautifully caramelized crust when baked. Like dates, honey's antimicrobial properties would have also helped extend the bread's shelf life. The use of honey or date syrup, known as BNR, transforms our understanding of their palate. They clearly had a well-developed taste for sweetness and understood how to use it to elevate a basic food into something special and celebratory. The savory side of their baking was equally sophisticated. Residue analyses have consistently found evidence of tubers from wetland plants like sedges and papyrus. These were not merely famine foods, they were likely dried and ground into a starch-rich flour that could be mixed with emmer to stretch the grain supply or alter the dough's properties. Chunks of onion or leek and herbs like coriander, dill, and fenugreek have also been identified. Imagine a savory loaf, redolent with the scent of fresh herbs and the pungent kick of allium, used to sop up a lentil stew. These additions show a culinary creativity aimed at everyday enjoyment, not just survival. They were using their bread as a vehicle for flavor, much like we might add olives or rosemary to a focaccia today. Perhaps most surprising is the evidence for spices like cumin and cinnamon. Cinnamon had to be imported from distant lands like Punt, making it incredibly valuable. Its presence in bread suggests some loaves were truly elite commodities, spiced breads fit for a pharaoh's table or as a high-value offering to appease a powerful god. These finds shatter any notion of a simple, uniform ancient diet. They reveal a complex food culture with different grades and types of bread, where the ingredients signaled status, purpose, and occasion. A worker's flatbread might contain nothing but emmer, water, and salt, while a loaf baked for a festival or a funerary feast could be studded with imported spices and dried fruit, a small, delicious testament to the baker's art and the infinite human desire to make the everyday extraordinary. The simple loaf of bread, more than any other single food, acted as a perfect mirror of ancient Egyptian society, reflecting its rigid hierarchies and vast inequalities in the most direct way possible. The differences weren't subtle, from the quality of the grain to the fineness of the grind, the type of leavening, and even the shape of the final loaf. Every aspect of your daily bread loudly announced your social standing to the world. For the vast majority of the population, the farmers, laborers, and artisans' bread was a dense, functional fuel. Their loaves were made from coarsely ground emmer or sometimes barley, milled on heavy saddle querns that left the flour gritty and packed with bran. This resulted in a dark, heavy, and chewy loaf that was incredibly nutritious but required significant effort to eat. This was the bread that built the pyramids, the standard ration paid to workers at Deir el-Medina, designed to provide maximum caloric energy and lasting satiety for a day of backbreaking labor. It was the edible symbol of a life defined by physical toil. In stark contrast, the bread that graced the tables of the elite was a product of refinement and luxury. For nobles, priests, and the royal family, bakers used flour that had been milled to a far finer consistency. This involved an immensely time-consuming process of repeatedly grinding and sifting the grain through linen cloth to remove the coarse bran and germ, a task that required the labor of many servants. The resulting white flour produced a lighter, softer, and more delicate bread, both in texture and flavor, but the distinctions went far beyond the grind. The elite enjoyed a much wider variety of breads, often incorporating expensive ingredients like honey from temple apiaries, precious dates, and even imported spices like cumin or cinnamon. Their loaves were frequently baked into intricate shapes, plates, spirals, or forms resembling animals and figures, signifying the artistry and extra labor involved. A tomb painting showing a wide array of breads was a clear status symbol, telling all who saw it that the deceased had access to the very best the bakery could offer. This culinary divide extended into the realm of the gods. The bread offered in temples was the absolute pinnacle of the baker's art, representing the finest quality achievable. These sacred loaves, destined to nourish the ka, or spirit, of a deity like Amun-Ra or Osiris, were made from the most meticulously processed flour, often mixed with milk, eggs, and the purest honey. They were baked in clean, dedicated temple bakeries under strict ritual conditions to ensure their purity. The shape of these divine offerings was also deeply symbolic, with certain forms like the conical loaf potentially representing the primeval mound of creation. After the god had consumed the spiritual essence of the offering, the physical bread was then redistributed, a practice known as reversion of offerings. This sanctified food would travel down the social hierarchy, first to the high priests, then to the lower temple staff, and sometimes to the people, creating a powerful, tangible link between the divine and the human world, with bread acting as the blessed medium. This system of bread inequality wasn't an accident. It was a meticulously enforced tool of state control and economic management. The central government, personified by the pharaoh and his vast administration, controlled the massive grain stores that were the nation's wealth. The distribution of this grain and, by extension, the bread made from it was how the state functioned. Workers were paid in bread and beer rations, the quantity and quality of which were carefully calibrated to their rank and importance. A skilled foreman would receive more and better loaves than a common laborer. This created a powerful incentive structure that reinforced the social order. Accepting your daily ration meant accepting your place within the highly stratified system. The coarseness of your bread was a daily, physical reminder of your position in the hierarchy, a form of social control baked into every meal. In this way, the humble loaf was far more than sustenance. It was the very currency of power, a tool used to build and maintain one of the most enduring and structured civilizations in human history. Recreating this ancient bread was far from a straightforward recipe follow. It was an archaeological puzzle where each ingredient and step presented a unique set of challenges that forced us to question our modern assumptions. The first and most immediate hurdle was sourcing the grain. Authentic Emmer wheat, the absolute foundation of the entire project, is not something you can find in a grocery store. Modern agriculture has largely abandoned these ancient hulled wheats in favor of higher-yielding, easier-to-process varieties. Our search led us to a network of dedicated heirloom grain farmers and seed banks, specialists in preserving genetic diversity. The Emmer we finally acquired was a revelation: small, dark kernels still tightly encased in their tough, inedible husks, arriving exactly as it would have to an ancient Egyptian baker. This wasn't a cleaned and polished commodity, it was a raw material, a direct, tangible link to the past that came with its own set of demanding instructions for use. Then came the deceptively simple task of milling. We had the grain, but how does one transform it into flour without modern machinery? We could have used an electric mill for consistency's sake, but that would have completely invalidated the experiment. The texture of the flour is everything. It defines the dough's behavior, its hydration, and ultimately the bread's character. We commissioned a skilled stonemason to create a precise replica of a granite saddle quern and hand grinder based on artifacts from Amarna. The physical reality of using it was a brutal education in ancient labor. The rocking, grinding motion is a full-body workout that engages the core, shoulders, and back. Within minutes, my muscles burned, and the air was thick with fine, abrasive stone dust. Producing a single cup of flour felt like a major achievement. This coarse, gritty result, speckled with bran, was a world away from the fluffy, uniform powder we're used to, and it immediately explained the dense, hearty texture described in archaeological findings. This wasn't an ingredient, it was a product of immense exertion. Perhaps our greatest leap of faith was with the leavening. We knew they used wild yeast, but how do you capture a 4,000-year-old microbiome? Simply leaving out a bowl of flour and tap water might capture local yeasts, but it wouldn't be authentically Egyptian. Our solution came from a collaboration with an archaeobotanist who studies ancient sediment samples. We used a small, dried sample of Nile riverbank sediment, rehydrated it, and used this water to mix our initial starter. This was our best chance of introducing the specific strains of wild Saccharomyces, cerevisiae yeast, and lactobacilli bacteria that would have been endemic to the region. For weeks, we fed and maintained this culture, watching with bated breath for signs of life. The moment it began to bubble and emit that distinct, tangy sourdough aroma was a triumph. It felt like we had successfully awakened a dormant microbial ecosystem that had once floated through the streets of Thebes. Interpreting the historical instructions was another layer of complexity. There are no surviving recipes with measurements or timings. Our guide was a collection of fragments, tomb paintings showing bakers kneeling over jars of dough, the physical evidence of conical molds blackened by fire, and the preserved loaves themselves. We had to become detectives, reverse engineering the process from these clues. The consistency of the dough, for instance, was a major question. Many tomb scenes show a very wet, batter-like dough being poured into molds. We experimented with hydrations, starting with a drier, kneadable dough and eventually moving to a much wetter, stickier batter that seemed to align better with the artistic evidence and which produced a better rise in the scorching heat of the replica molds. Knowing when the dough was ready required learning to read it through smell, sight, and touch, abandoning the clock and trusting the instincts of an ancient baker. Finally, managing the oven was a lesson in humility and fire taming. Our replica, built from clay and straw, behaved nothing like a modern appliance. It didn't have a temperature dial, it had a personality, learning to build the fire slowly, to read the color of the clay walls to gauge the heat, and to know the precise moment to sweep aside the embers and insert the dough was a skill born entirely of practice and failure. Our first few attempts resulted in loaves that were charred on the outside and stubbornly raw within, or undercooked and dense. Each mistake was a conversation with the past, teaching us about the immense skill and intuitive knowledge these bakers possessed. They didn't have our scientific understanding, but they had a deep, generational mastery of their materials and their environment. Overcoming these challenges wasn't about achieving perfection by our modern standards, it was about listening to the clues left behind and allowing the process itself, in all its messy, demanding, and unpredictable glory, to guide us toward a genuine taste of history. Placing this ancient Emmer loaf side by side with a standard slice of modern supermarket bread reveals a chasm not just in time, but in philosophy. The most immediate difference is in the very soul of the ingredient list. Our recreated bread contains 3 components: Emmer wheat, water, and salt. A typical commercial loaf, however, often reads like a chemistry experiment, featuring a long list of preservatives like calcium propionate to prevent mold, emulsifiers like mono and diglycerides to create a soft, uniform crumb, and added sugars and fats to enhance flavor and extend shelf life for weeks. Where the ancient baker relied on the natural preservative power of lactic acid from slow fermentation, the modern food industry relies on laboratory compounds to achieve a similar, though far less nutritious, longevity. This shift from a living food to a stable, inert product represents a fundamental change in our relationship with what we eat. We've traded microbial complexity for logistical convenience. The disparity in preparation time is perhaps the most humbling contrast. Our entire recreation, from dehulling the grain to pulling a finished loaf from the oven, represented days of focused labor. A dedicated home baker today, using pre-milled flour and commercial yeast, can produce a loaf from start to finish in under 4 hours with only about 15 minutes of active effort. The ancient process was inextricably woven into the fabric of daily life, a continuous cycle of maintaining the starter, grinding the grain, and tending the fire. There was no separation between the act of baking and the rhythm of the household. Modern baking, even at its most artisanal, is an event, a discrete activity we schedule into our lives. We have effectively outsourced the immense physical labor of our ancestors to industrial mills and factories, gaining incredible time efficiency but losing the deep, somatic connection to the origin of our food. The ancient Egyptian didn't just bake bread, they lived in a constant, engaged dialogue with the process. Nutritionally, the comparison is stark. The modern industrial loaf, often made from refined white flour, is primarily a source of simple carbohydrates. The refining process strips away the bran and germ, removing the very parts of the wheat berry that contain most of the fiber, vitamins, and minerals. What remains is the starchy endosperm, which our bodies rapidly convert to sugar. This is why you can eat several slices of fluffy white bread and feel hungry again an hour later. It provides a quick caloric burst but lacks sustaining nutritional power. Our ancient Emmer bread, by contrast, was a complete nutritional package. The coarse, whole grain flour provided sustained energy from complex carbs and fiber, while the slow, wild fermentation pre-digested the grains, unlocking higher levels of nutrients and making them easier for the body to absorb. Every bite was dense with protein, magnesium, zinc, and B vitamins, and it acted as a probiotic, supporting gut health. The ancient loaf was designed to fuel physical labor for hours. The modern version is often designed for momentary satisfaction and long shelf life. This isn't to romanticize the past. Their life was undoubtedly harder, and famine was a constant threat, but there are powerful lessons embedded in that gritty, tangy crumb. The ancient Egyptian approach demonstrates the profound value of slowness. Their forced, slow fermentation, a result of relying on wild, airborne yeasts, was the key to unlocking both superior flavor and nutrition. This stands in direct opposition to our culture of speed, where fast-rising commercial yeast dominates. The rediscovery of slow fermented sourdough by modern wellness and food movements is, in many ways, a return to this ancient wisdom, a recognition that good things, both in terms of taste and health, cannot be rushed. Furthermore, their bread was a product of its specific place, a concept known as terroir. The flavor of a Theban loaf was infused with the wild yeasts of the Nile and the mineral content of its water, making it unique to that location. Our modern industrial food system, in its quest for consistency, has largely erased terroir from staple foods. A loaf of mass-produced bread tastes identical in Tokyo and Toronto, its flavor profile dictated by additives rather than environment. The ancient model suggests a different path, one where bread regains its local character and connection to the ecosystem, a quality now cherished by locavores and artisan bakers. Ultimately, the greatest lesson might be about mindfulness. The sheer effort required to produce a single loaf meant that bread was valued in a way we can scarcely comprehend today. It was currency, it was religion, it was life. In our world of abundance, bread has become commonplace, something we often consume without a second thought. The ancient Egyptian process, from field to oven, fostered a deep, inherent respect for the grain and the hands that transformed it. Reconnecting with these older, slower methods, even in a small way, can reintroduce that sense of gratitude and mindfulness into our daily meals, reminding us that this simple food is not just a commodity, but the culmination of sun, soil, and human effort, a timeless miracle we are privileged to enjoy. This dense, fiber-rich bread was a powerful digestive ally in a way modern processed foods simply are not. The coarse stone grinding left the bran and germ fully intact, packing every loaf with an immense amount of insoluble fiber. This roughage acted like a natural scrub brush for the digestive system, promoting healthy gut motility and preventing constipation, a crucial benefit in an environment where dehydration was a constant risk. But the benefits went far beyond mere regularity. This dietary fiber served as a prebiotic, a specialized plant fiber that essentially acts as fertilizer for the beneficial bacteria residing in our gut microbiome. By consuming this bread daily, the ancient Egyptians were actively cultivating a diverse and robust community of gut flora, which in turn supported everything from a strong immune response to the production of essential vitamins and the reduction of systemic inflammation. Their daily staple was unknowingly performing a critical function we are only now beginning to fully appreciate through modern nutritional science. The absence of modern additives and processing methods is another stark contrast with profound health implications. Their bread contained no refined sugars, no industrial seed oils, no chemical preservatives, and no artificial bleaching agents. The entire nutritional profile came from the whole grain, the wild fermentation, and the intense heat of the oven. This meant their bodies were not constantly battling the inflammatory effects of processed ingredients and oxidated oils that are so prevalent in today's diets. The natural lactic acid produced during the long fermentation acted as a potent preservative, inhibiting the growth of mold and harmful bacteria without any need for laboratory-made compounds. This clean, minimalist ingredient list provided pure, unadulterated nutrition, free from the metabolic confusion and potential long-term health consequences linked to the chemical cocktails found in many contemporary packaged foods. Perhaps the most significant benefit came from the slow, wild fermentation process itself, which acted as a form of natural pre-digestion. The lactic acid bacteria and yeasts broke down the complex phytates and enzyme inhibitors naturally present in the whole emmer grain. This is crucial because phytates can bind to minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium in the digestive tract, preventing your body from absorbing them. By neutralizing these anti-nutrients, the fermentation process dramatically increased the bioavailability of the vitamins and minerals packed into the emmer wheat. Essentially, the ancient Egyptians were extracting far more nutritional value from each bite than we would if we simply baked the same flour today without fermenting it first. Their bread was not just filling, it was a highly efficient system for delivering essential micronutrients directly to their bodies. This nutritional powerhouse offers powerful lessons for our modern diets, which are often dominated by highly processed, quickly digested carbohydrates. Reintroducing whole, fermented grains can be a revolutionary step for gut health. The combination of high fiber and probiotics found in a loaf like this can help rebalance the microbiome, which is often depleted by antibiotics, processed foods, and high sugar diets. For individuals struggling with blood sugar management, the low glycemic index of this dense, fiber-packed bread provides a slow, steady release of glucose into the bloodstream, preventing the sharp spikes and crashes associated with white bread and promoting sustained energy levels and better insulin sensitivity. The high satiety factor also means you feel full longer, which can aid in healthy weight management by reducing the urge for between-meal snacking on less nutritious options. While we cannot and perhaps would not want to fully revert to the arduous daily labor of an ancient Egyptian baker, we can certainly embrace the principles behind their bread. Seeking out true whole grain or sprouted grain flours, exploring long fermentation sourdough techniques, and prioritizing loaves with simple, recognizable ingredients are all ways to capture a measure of this ancient wisdom. Incorporating these kinds of breads into our diet is not about nostalgic reenactment, it's about making a conscious choice for a more nutritious, gut-friendly, and sustainable source of sustenance, one that connects us to a timeless tradition of nourishing the body with the honest, powerful simplicity of real food. The day for an ancient Egyptian, from the humblest farmer to the most powerful vizier, began and ended with bread. It was the unchanging rhythm of their existence, the steady drumbeat of sustenance that structured every meal and every social interaction. Imagine a laborer's family at dawn, stirring in their mud brick home. There is no elaborate cooking fire to start. The morning meal is simple, likely leftovers from the previous evening. They would tear into yesterday's coarse, gritty loaf, perhaps dipping it into a simple bowl of beer, a thick, nutritious, porridge-like brew, or chewing it alongside a handful of onions or dates. This quick, practical breakfast was about fueling up for the day's toil, a moment of quiet preparation before stepping out into the heat of the sun. The bread itself, though left over, was still nourishing, its tangy, sour flavor a familiar and comforting start to the day. As the sun climbed to its zenith, the main meal would be prepared. This was often a stew or pottage, bubbling away in a clay pot over a small fire, but the stew wasn't the main event, the bread was. Tomb paintings from the New Kingdom, like those in the tomb of Nakht at Thebes, show us these domestic scenes with beautiful clarity. A family would gather around a shared bowl, and each person would use a torn piece of their flatbread to scoop up the hearty mixture of lentils, vegetables, and occasionally fish or a small amount of meat. The bread was their spoon, their plate, and the bulk of their meal all in one. This wasn't just about convenience, it was a deeply social way of eating, reinforcing family bonds as everyone shared from the same pot. The bread ensured that not a single drop of the flavorful broth or a morsel of food was wasted. For most Egyptians, this was the reality of daily dining, a wholesome, efficient, and communal experience centered around the ever-present loaf. But bread's role extended far beyond the walls of the family home. It was the engine of the state, the fuel that powered the great national projects. The most famous example comes from the village of Deir el-Medina, home to the elite artisans who built and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These skilled workers were essentially paid in bread and beer. The records are incredibly detailed, etched into flakes of limestone known as ostraca. We know a standard laborer might receive 10 loaves a day, while a foreman could earn 50 or more. The size and quality of the loaf were even specified, creating a clear, edible hierarchy. The workmen's wives would often take their husbands' rations and use them to barter with other villagers for fish, pottery, or cloth, turning the state-issued bread into a versatile local currency. This system shows us that bread wasn't just food, it was a sophisticated economic tool that organized labor, denoted status, and facilitated trade throughout the community. When it was time for a festival or a celebration, bread transformed once again, becoming a symbol of joy and abundance. During the great festival of the god Ammon at Thebes, the streets would be packed with people, and the air would be filled with the incredible smell of dozens of temporary bakeries working at full capacity. For these special occasions, bakers would pull out all the stops, creating loaves in elaborate shapes to honor the gods or to simply delight the revelers. Imagine the wonder of a child being handed a loaf baked in the shape of a fish or a spiral-shaped roll dusted with sesame seeds. Wealthy nobles hosting banquets would compete to display the most variety, with baskets overflowing with different breads, long, thin loaves like batons, small, round rolls, and rich, sweet breads enriched with honey and dates. These feasts were a sensory explosion, and the diversity of bread on offer was a direct testament to the host's wealth and generosity, an edible demonstration of their power and good taste. This deep integration of bread into every facet of life is perhaps best captured in a simple, beautiful artifact, a wooden model from the tomb of a Middle Kingdom official named Mekhitar. This model, designed to magically provide food for him in the afterlife, depicts a bustling bakery and brewery. We see vendors vigorously kneading dough in large jars, while others stoke the fires under rows of conical bread molds. An overseer watches carefully, ensuring the precious grain is not wasted. This snapshot, frozen in time for eternity, tells us everything. It wasn't enough for Mekhitar to have a model of a granary, he needed the entire process of bread making to be represented. His eternal happiness, his very survival in the afterlife, depended on the continuous production of this most essential food. From the break of dawn to the star-filled night, from the simplest meal to the most extravagant divine offering, bread was the constant, unifying thread woven through the entire tapestry of ancient Egyptian life. This hands-on journey into ancient baking does far more than satisfy our curiosity. It represents a vital branch of experimental archaeology, a field where we stop looking at artifacts behind glass and start using them to actively test our theories about the past. By physically recreating this bread using their methods, we move beyond educated guesses and enter the realm of empirical evidence. We're not just reading about how heavy a grinding stone was, we're feeling the ache in our shoulders after using it for 20 minutes. We're not just theorizing that Nile water could capture wild yeast, we're watching it bubble and smelling that distinct sour aroma come to life. This process transforms static museum displays into dynamic, living history, allowing us to challenge long-held assumptions and answer questions that texts and artifacts alone cannot resolve. One of the most significant insights gained is a profound appreciation for the sheer amount of skilled labor involved. Textbooks might briefly mention bread was a dietary staple, but experiencing the multi-day process firsthand reveals the immense human infrastructure required to feed an entire civilization. We can now better calculate the caloric cost of bread production itself. If it took me, a reasonably fit modern person, over an hour of intense labor to produce enough coarse flour for just 2 loaves, how many full-time grinders were needed to supply a work crew of 50 pyramid builders? This physical experimentation allows archaeologists to model ancient economies with greater accuracy, estimating the number of bakers, grinders, and fuel gatherers required to support a city like Memphis or Thebes, turning abstract notions of labor into tangible, quantifiable data. Furthermore, the recreation helps us troubleshoot ancient technologies. For instance, many theories suggested the conical bread molds were used like modern baking pans, placed in an oven with the dough inside. But when we tried this, the results were disappointing. The dough often stuck to the mold and cooked unevenly. It was only by following the artistic clues and preheating the molds in the fire itself that we achieved the dramatic rise and easy release shown in tomb paintings. This successful method, proven through trial and error, solves an archaeological puzzle and demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of thermal dynamics. The ancient Egyptians weren't just putting dough in pots, they were using ceramics as heat batteries, a clever and efficient technology we might have underestimated without hands-on testing. This experimental approach also sheds new light on the health and daily experiences of ancient people. The gritty texture of our finished loaf, a direct result of the stone grinding, provides a compelling explanation for the distinctive dental wear patterns found on Egyptian skeletons. Archaeologists have long noted the excessive abrasion on their teeth, often attributing it to sand in the flour. While that was certainly a factor, our experiment shows that the flour's inherent coarseness was likely the primary culprit. Every single bite of their daily bread was gently sanding down their enamel, a small but cumulative physical price paid for their sustenance. This kind of insight connects a mundane artifact, a tooth, directly to a daily activity, building a more intimate and humanized picture of their lives. Ultimately, this project underscores that experimental archaeology is about embracing failure as a form of data. Our first few loaves were inedible, burnt on the outside, raw in the middle, or stubbornly flat. Each failure was a lesson that brought us closer to their reality. It taught us about the precise heat management their ovens required, the specific hydration needed for Emmer flour, and the subtle signs that a wild yeast starter was at its peak. This method doesn't just tell us what they did, it helps us understand what they knew. It reveals the deep, tacit knowledge passed down through generations, the feel of the dough, the sound of the grind, the color of the fire, that never made it into any hieroglyphic text but was absolutely essential to their survival and their culture. By getting our hands dirty, we gain a richer, more respectful, and undoubtedly more accurate window into the incredible ingenuity of the ancient Egyptian baker. The story of Egyptian bread, however, doesn't end at the borders of the pharaoh's domain. This culinary technology was far too powerful and effective to remain contained, rippling out across the ancient world and fundamentally influencing the diets and cultures of their neighbors. The Egyptians were the undisputed breadbasket of the ancient Mediterranean, and their mastery of large-scale grain production and baking became a key export, both of the product itself and the knowledge behind it. Through trade, diplomacy, and conquest, the humble loaf became an instrument of soft power, carrying a taste of Egyptian innovation to distant shores. One of the most direct conduits for this influence was trade across the Mediterranean. Egyptian grain ships were a common sight in the ports of the Levant, Anatolia, and the Aegean. The kingdoms and city-states of these regions, often lacking the predictable, massive agricultural surplus provided by the Nile, came to rely on Egyptian exports, especially in times of famine or poor harvests. This trade wasn't just about shipping sacks of raw Emmer wheat, it involved the exchange of knowledge. Canaanite and Phoenician merchants, renowned seafarers themselves, would have observed Egyptian baking techniques in the bustling ports of the Nile Delta. They saw the efficiency of the conical bread molds and the consistent results of the sourdough process, adopting and adapting these technologies for their own use. The Phoenicians, in particular, became instrumental in spreading these ideas as they established colonies across the Mediterranean, from Carthage in North Africa to cities in Sicily, Sardinia, and Spain. They carried the concept of leavened bread with them, planting the seeds of a baking revolution that would eventually reach the far corners of the Roman Empire. This exchange went both ways, creating a fascinating culinary dialogue. While Egypt exported its grain and techniques, it also imported new ideas. The influence of other cultures is evident in the archaeological record at sites like Avaris, the capital of the Hyksos rulers in the Nile Delta. Here we find distinctive Canaanite-style bread ovens, known as tabuns, alongside traditional Egyptian conical molds. This suggests a period of technological cross-pollination where baking methods were shared and blended. Later, during the New Kingdom Empire, when Egypt's reach extended deep into the Levant, soldiers and administrators stationed abroad would have encountered local breads, perhaps made with different grains like spelt or flavored with new herbs and oils. Upon returning home, they likely brought a taste for these foreign varieties, encouraging Egyptian bakers to experiment and expand their own repertoire, adding a layer of international flair to their ancient craft. The most profound and lasting impact of Egyptian bread making, however, is undoubtedly its legacy in the classical world of Greece and Rome. The Greeks, who established the trading colony of Naucratis in the Nile Delta, were utterly fascinated by Egyptian culture. They recognized the superiority of Egyptian agriculture and baking, and Greek writers like Herodotus wrote with amazement about the wonders of the Nile and the strange, delicious bread of the Egyptians. The Greek word for bread, artos, is believed by some linguists to have ancient Egyptian roots, a subtle linguistic clue to the direction of influence. More importantly, the Greeks adopted and refined the Egyptian technique of using a fermented dough starter. They developed a wider variety of breads, often using wheat varieties more common to their own region, but the fundamental principle of captured wild yeast was a gift from the Nile. It was the Romans, however, who industrialized and globalized the Egyptian model on an unprecedented scale. After Egypt became the breadbasket of the Roman Empire following its annexation by Augustus, the grain of the Nile fed the million-plus inhabitants of the city of Rome. The Roman state took the Egyptian system of grain rationing and perfected it, distributing free bread to its citizens to ensure political stability. The professional Roman baker, or pister, was a highly respected tradesman, and his large, efficient bakeries were direct descendants of the massive state-run operations found in ancient Thebes or Amarna. The Romans advanced the technology, inventing more sophisticated water-powered mills for grinding and larger, more efficient ovens, but the core idea, that bread, produced on a massive scale, was the foundation of imperial power, was a lesson they learned directly from the pharaohs. The Roman love affair with bread, which they then spread to every corner of their vast empire from Britain to Mesopotamia, has its true origins in the fertile fields and ingenious bakeries of ancient Egypt. In this way, a staple food born on the banks of the Nile became one of the enduring cornerstones of Western civilization itself. Now that we've journeyed together from the fields of Emmer wheat to the fiery mouth of an ancient oven, I want to turn the focus to you. Take a moment to think about the bread you might have in your own kitchen right now. That soft, pre-sliced loaf in its plastic bag represents the culmination of thousands of years of innovation, but it also stands worlds apart from the dense, living sustenance that fueled an entire civilization. It's not about judgment, but about perspective, recognizing that every time we choose what to eat, we're participating in a long, human story of nourishment and technology. Consider the contrast. Their bread was a days-long project of grinding, fermenting, and baking, a central pillar of daily life. Our modern version is often a quick, convenient purchase designed for longevity and ease. One isn't inherently better than the other, but understanding the difference allows us to make more conscious, informed choices about what we bring to our own tables. I am genuinely curious to hear what part of this ancient baking journey resonated most with you. Was it the sheer physical effort of grinding the grain, the cleverness of capturing wild yeast from the air, or the profound spiritual role bread played in their view of the afterlife? Did any particular detail truly surprise you? For me, it was the realization that bread was a form of currency, that a worker's wage was paid in loaves, making the baker's output the literal foundation of the economy. Drop a comment below and share your biggest aha moment from this exploration. I read every single one and love hearing what sparks your curiosity. Your thoughts and questions often become the inspiration for our next deep dive into history's mysteries. If this taste of the past has inspired you to get your own hands floury, I highly encourage you to experiment with ancient grains. You don't need a replica oven or a granite quern to start, though that is a thrilling project. Simply seeking out a bag of Emmer flour, often sold as farro medio, or spelt or einkorn from a local health food store or online retailer can be your first step. Try substituting it for a portion of the white flour in your favorite sourdough recipe. You'll immediately notice the difference: the darker color, the nutty aroma, the way the dough behaves with a unique, hearty character. It's a direct, tangible connection to these ancient methods, a way to bring a fragment of this history into your own home and onto your own plate. Baking, even in a small way, becomes an act of connection, a mindful practice that links you to everyone who has ever mixed flour and water and waited for the magic of fermentation to begin. So, what have we truly learned from this extraordinary journey into the heart of ancient baking? The findings from our recreation point to one undeniable conclusion: the ancient Egyptian baker was a master of their craft, an ingenious innovator who turned simple, local ingredients into a sophisticated staple through a profound understanding of their natural environment. They didn't just make food, they harnessed the very ecosystem around them: the wild yeasts in the Nile air, the unique properties of Emmer wheat, the intense heat of a mud brick oven, and transformed it into the lifeblood of a civilization. Their methods were not primitive, they were brilliantly effective, a perfect marriage of observation, skill, and resourcefulness that we are only now beginning to fully appreciate through the lens of modern science and experimental archaeology. This project has given us a profound new respect for the sheer amount of knowledge, both technical and intuitive, that was passed down through generations. These bakers were the unsung engineers of their time, managing complex fermentation processes without thermometers, achieving consistent results with wildly variable ingredients, and scaling their production to feed thousands, all while imbuing their work with deep religious and cultural significance. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that history's greatest advancements are often found not in gold or grand monuments, but in the humble, daily rituals of nourishment and survival. They built an empire not just with stone, but with dough. If this deep dive into the past has sparked your curiosity and made you see history in a new, more flavorful light, then you're exactly where you belong. Our channel is dedicated to pulling history off the page and bringing it to life through these hands-on, sensory recreations. We're constantly exploring forgotten technologies, ancient recipes, and the daily lives of people across the centuries. To make sure you don't miss our next adventure into humanity's fascinating past, be sure to hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications. We have so many more historical mysteries to unravel together, and your support is what makes these incredible journeys of discovery possible. Thank you for joining me on this one. Until next time.